Dennis thought this would be just like any other day. He packed up his hunting gear and headed to the Amazon rainforest, where he'd hunted many times before. But no one could have prepared him for what he was about to discover today. He looked around, hunting for prey, when he suddenly saw a huge animal moving in the distance. This was something he had never seen before. Dennis took a closer look at the animal. At first, he thought it was a giant gorilla, but there were features he couldn't explain. The animal looked almost human-like, and then he realizes this could be a discovery of a lifetime, so Dennis wasted no time and shot a tranquilizing dart at it. The animal dropped to the ground, and Dennis dragged him to his jeep. There was only one place he knew he could go. Dennis drove straight to the lab. He had to be sure his discovery was correct. He persuaded the doctor to do DNA tests on the animal and waited for the results. But when the results finally came in, they shocked everyone. But what kind of animal was this? Will his discovery turn out to be true? And what will be so shocking about the DNA test? Before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Dennis lives near the Amazon rainforest in Brazil and often goes hunting there. He hunts for armadillos, capybaras, and/or deer. He then sells his catches or eats them. He used to go hunting with his father and now does it on his own. But he will never hunt alone again after what happens next. Dennis has a strict area where he always goes hunting. He knows he always comes back with at least 1 or 2 catches. But today, he decided to go somewhere else. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to walk more to the south instead of the east. But he didn't know then what he knows now. Dennis had thought of a simple solution to finding his way back. He tied little strings around a few trees. He hadn't been to this particular part of the forest before, so this way he would know where to go back to. And he would later realize he had made a very smart decision. After walking for 20 minutes, he stopped and hid behind a fallen tree. There he waited until an animal appeared. He was in a part of the forest that he had never been to before, so he had to be very careful. Suddenly, Dennis notices 2 yellow eyes looking straight at him from a tree. He knows exactly what that means: a jaguar. He slowly steps backward, but hears a rustle in the leaves. This startles him and he begins to run away, not looking at the strings anymore. Not the smartest move in a giant rainforest. After Dennis had run a few meters, he stopped and began to pant heavily. It was at the time he stopped running that it dawned on him that the animal wasn't after him all along. But by the time Dennis came to the realization, it was too late, as he was in a bigger problem. At the place Dennis stopped, there was no sign of the string trail he had tied to trees earlier. He began to wonder about how he would find a way out of the forest. Dennis became worried as it was getting late. The last thing he wanted to do was to spend the night in the Amazon rainforest. Since he didn't have the knowledge or appropriate equipment to survive in the forest, he needed to look for a way out as soon as possible. While thinking of the best way to get out of the forest, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his head. Almost at the same time, everything turned black. After about an hour, which to Dennis seemed like a second, he woke up. He couldn't believe that he had slept. As his eyes got clearer and he tried to look around, Dennis was startled by what he saw. Dennis realized that he had to a different spot, but he couldn't wrap his head around how that happened. After trying to think about how Dennis concluded that someone must have moved him there while he was unconscious. As he tried to get up slowly, he touched his head and felt a big, painful bump. With the pain in his head, he still got up, and while trying to find out how he would be out of the forest, he looked around him. Luckily for Dennis, he saw a familiar string, and with it, he got back to his trail. Carefully, he followed the strings and arrived back at his car. He heaved a heavy sigh of relief on seeing his car, and with a grateful heart, he drove home. Even though he was happy to have found his way back home, Dennis was confused about how he got back to his trail and what had hit him in the head. He slept with so many questions in his heart. To his greatest surprise, he woke up the following day with a great headache and still feeling curious about what had happened the day before. Since the curiosity to find out what or who had hit him in the head the day before in the forest wouldn't leave him, he decided to drive back to the Amazon rainforest. As soon as Dennis got to the forest, he got his gear out of the car trunk and began his journey. Dennis tried to follow the same string trail he had made the day before, but got stuck while following it. Dennis got stuck because he couldn't remember the route he took when he ran away from the jaguar. While trying to find his way, a random thought popped into his mind. Dennis decided to follow it, so he walked east, even though he had no idea if he was following the right way. After about 30 minutes of walking on the path, he turned around and realized he was totally lost again. After it dawned on him that he had missed his way again, he began to wonder how it happened. As he was contemplating whether to go back or continue his journey, he heard a loud rustle in the bushes. Since the sound was coming from behind him, he slowly turned around. But immediately he saw what it was. He dropped to the ground. When he initially heard the loud rustle, he thought it was a giant gorilla moving behind him. But his assumptions proved wrong because he noticed some strange things as he watched closely. He was gripped with fear by what he saw. Dennis became more frightened when he remembered he was all alone in the forest. As Dennis watched closely, he realized the animal stood on two legs, slightly hunched, and had hair covering its body. The most shocking detail was its human-like hands. A thought crossed his mind. Could this be Bigfoot? If it was, Dennis knew he had made the discovery of a lifetime. He quickly snapped a picture, but it looked too fake to convince anyone. Determined to prove what he'd seen, Dennis moved quietly and took out his tranquilizer. A slight noise made the creature turn its back to him. His golden opportunity. He fired the dart, hitting it squarely in the buttock. The creature let out a faint growl before collapsing. Dennis waited to ensure it was unconscious before approaching. Carefully, he grabbed its legs and began dragging it through the forest. The creature was heavy and Dennis had to pause multiple times, but he knew he had to act fast before it woke up. Finally, he reached the forest's edge but realized he wasn't where he started. His truck was visible in the distance, but exhaustion left him wondering if he could manage the final stretch. Covering the creature with leaves and branches, Dennis sprinted to his truck, drove back, and loaded the animal into the bed. Sitting in the truck, Dennis debated his next move. Taking it to a vet was risky. They'd claim the discovery as their own. Then he remembered his brother-in-law, Connor, a doctor. It wasn't the same as a vet, but Connor could run a DNA test and keep the discovery within the family. With that plan in mind, Dennis began the half-hour drive to Connor's lab. Throughout the drive, Dennis kept checking the rearview mirror. The creature looked even larger and more intimidating from this angle. Suddenly, he noticed movement. It was waking up. Pulling over, Dennis quickly shot another tranquilizer dart. The animal went limp again, but Dennis knew he was running out of time. Back on the road, Dennis noticed flashing lights in his rearview mirror. A cop was following him. Panicked, he turned into an alleyway, narrowly avoiding being pulled over. He couldn't explain what he was transporting and didn't want to risk losing the creature. Finally, Dennis arrived at the lab. Relieved, he knocked on the door but received no response. Impatient, he banged louder, hoping Connor was inside. He heard movement behind the door and waited anxiously for his brother-in-law to answer. The door opened to reveal Dennis's brother-in-law, Connor, looking annoyed. "Dennis, what the hell are you doing here?" Dennis quickly replied, "Connor, I have something incredible I need you to see." He led Connor to the truck, where the strange creature lay unconscious. Connor's irritation turned to astonishment as he examined the animal. "This is fascinating," Connor admitted, though skeptical, "but I don't have time for this. My next patient is in 10 minutes. Dennis, undeterred, insisted this discovery was once in a lifetime and begged Connor to run a DNA test. Reluctantly, Connor agreed, unable to contain his own curiosity. He carefully took a DNA sample while Dennis kept an eye on the creature. Afterward, Connor made it clear the creature couldn't stay at the lab. Dennis understood and drove home, parking his truck in the garage. He tightly secured the creature, pacing anxiously while awaiting the test results. Hours passed, and he knew it wouldn't stay unconscious much longer. At the lab, Connor couldn't focus on his patients, checking the DNA test results between appointments. When he finally saw the outcome, his face turned pale. He immediately called Dennis, urgency in his voice. Dennis picked up, and Connor exclaimed, "The results are shocking. How is this possible?" Dennis, alarmed by Connor's tone, knew he had to act fast. Hanging up the phone, he jumped into his truck and drove back to the forest. Connor tried calling repeatedly, but Dennis ignored the calls. He suspected Connor would want the creature studied endlessly by scientists, a fate Dennis couldn't allow. Reaching the forest, Dennis untied the creature and ensured it was still unharmed. He dragged it back to the spot where he had found it, hoping it would wake up safely. Suddenly, the creature stirred. Dennis quickly backed away, watching from a distance as it rose unsteadily to its feet. It looked confused but gradually regained composure. Without hesitation, it walked deeper into the forest until it disappeared into the trees. Dennis exhaled, feeling certain he had done the right thing. Moments later, he finally answered Connor's frantic call. "You need to bring him back immediately," Connor shouted. "The DNA result! It's human! That creature is human!" Dennis froze, his suspicions confirmed. Without saying another word, he hung up and returned to his truck. He couldn't risk Connor or anyone finding the man again. Dennis drove home, vowing never to hunt in that forest again. He knew others like Connor would search for the creature. To Dennis, this was no mere discovery. It was a person, someone who belonged in the forest. He made it his mission to protect the forest and the people within it, no matter the cost.